participates as a manager of strategic partnerships and new business in Instituto Butantan in São Paulo. He's worked there for more than 14 years. He's a pharmacist and has a PhD in health law and also public health and management of the biopharmaceuticals. He is also a member of the executive committee of the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network. We also have Judit Sanjuan. She is a policy specialist on health technologies, innovation, and access at the UNDP HIV Health and Development Group in New York. She's a lawyer and a policy expert with over 20 years of experience in the strategies to create and disseminate global public goods, including innovation and access to medicines, diagnostics, and other health technologies. She has a law degree and a master in international relations from University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona and law science and technology from Stanford Law School in the USA. So I will pass on the mic to Professor Claudia Chamas. Please, the room is yours. Thank you. I will try to share my screen. I'm sharing it. Can you see it okay?
Sim, sim, conseguimos ver.
Yes, yes, we can see it. Yes, it's great. Thank you. Good afternoon and good evening to all of you. Some of you are at night. It's great to see familiar faces, my dear friends, and colleagues from such great institutions. I want to thank you all for inviting me from South Center and Idec to institutions that fight for the common well-being. So the theme I bring today is a brief analysis, two aspects of access from the experience of Fiocruz with technology transfer in vaccines against COVID-19. As far as acquiring vaccines, Brazil has used many sources. I'm not going to go into details, but we have the agreement from Fiocruz with AstraZeneca. I'm going to talk just a little about that. We also have Sinovac and Butantan, which will be talked about soon. And there was also purchases of doses such as Pfizer, and we've had some amount from COVAX. In the contract between Fiocruz and AstraZeneca, it's important to mention that the main objective is to guarantee the universal access by the Brazilian population. And apart from that, promote the total transfer of technology from AstraZeneca to Biomanguinho factory from Fiocruz. Also reminding you that this internalization of technology, this process, it has risks and uncertainties. They are built in. They are because of the characteristics of the pandemic itself and also the process of generating technological innovation. I'm not going to go into detail of each step that happened before signing the agreements with AstraZeneca, but this would be a presentation in itself, and it involves many legal aspects. But I want to mention two important issues and discuss what's relevant in the strategy of access. The first moment was signing a contract of technological order from AstraZeneca with AstraZeneca. I'm sorry to stop you. We can see your screen well, but it's not in the presentation mode. Could you try to do that so it would be easier?
Então agora
Desculpa a
melhorou.
interrupção.
Não,
Isso.
tudo bem.
That's perfect now. Thank you. I always make this kind of mistakes, even after using Zoom so much. So continuing, the first important date was the signature of the contract of technological order, which this company has the production rights, distribution rights, and commercialization rights of the vaccine against COVID-19, developed by the University of Oxford. This signature of this order was done in September 2020. This agreement guaranteed to Biomanguinhos Fiocruz the access to more than 100 million doses of the pharmaceutical, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, which involves formulation, bottling, labeling, documentation, and packaging. And of course, the quality control as well. It has to do with sterility tests, and at the same time, it guaranteed to Fiocruz the total transferal of technology um, as agreed by the understanding memorandum, which was signed in July 2020. And since then, up to last month, we had many uh, orders of API, imported API, to allow this production here in Brazil, in Fiocruz. There also was a publishing of a measure that became a law, which dedicated an extraordinary credit of almost 2 billion reais for supporting this whole process. I think she's stuck. So the second stage of the project, the strategical project, was to incorporate the technology of the vaccine against COVID. In June, we had the arrival from the cell bank and the virus, the adenovirus, making it possible to start this phase of the production of the national API. And then we
Lembrando que o contrato ele contém segredos industriais e essa é uma característica central desses processos para vacinas. É projeto que conta, então, com uma tecnologia inédita.
That counts with an unknown technology, a new way of dealing with the virus that would be incorporated 100% and in record time. And of course, there were a lot of challenges, as I will show you. There were 3 main stages that have already happened. The 2 batches of pre-validation and 3 of validation, quality control and testing in Brazil and the USA, the registration with the national agency from from the sanitary agency, which is called Anvisa. On November 26, Fiocruz submitted to Anvisa the request of alteration post-registration from Anvisa. Anvisa is analyzing, has been analyzing the equivalence of the productive process to prove that the vaccines are produced with API, that they have the same efficacy and quality of the ones processed with the imported API. So apart from the analysis, analytical methodologies, they're also accessing the productive process. Everything is checked by Anvisa, the production lines, the factories. So just to signal that as a result of the importation of the API and this production phase, we delivered last week almost 3 million doses, and in total 148 million doses have been delivered to the Brazilian program of immunization. So I have about 10 more minutes. Just to tell you the end part, which is the analysis of access analysis. The process of technology transfer has been successful. What characterizes it and what are the main factors and also the main challenges in this process? Because it's not an easy process, it's expensive, it's complex, and totally brand new within the time and the challenge of the pandemic. First, Fiocruz was able to quickly mobilize itself to evaluate the issue of pandemic since the beginning. So in many aspects of digital vigilance, epidemiology, of genomic vigilance, Fiocruz also had many technological scenarios done there to analyze the technological options, including the new technologies such as viral vector, which was the choice. And of course, having all the expertise that Biomanguinhos had with other vaccines and the facility to adapt the installations of the factory, the facilities, and the availability of the companies for the technology transfer. There was also a very important factor, which was the experience of Biomanguinhos with many processes of technology transfer, international technology transfer. It's a very capacitated team. They have faced many issues when negotiating. There was also, of course, support from the state. This is essential. We also had a good technological and scientific capacitation in vaccines, not just in Fiocruz, but in Butantan, the universities. We have a very good scientific and technological support. And there was a structure for local production. So we already had this structure. Another challenge was relating to the inputs and also the equipment, the ingredients. So there was an issue of supply and demand, international supply and demand, and we're still in a market. There have been many, let's say, disputes. So this affects the transference, and we have trained professionals. Apart from people in the factories, we also had to hire new people and train these people. Financial resources, they aren't trivial, you know. We need a lot of resources destined for this. We've been having a great relationship with the company, the right legal standards. So it is complex, the legal part of things, and it involves hiring a product, having a product that wasn't finalized, there was something still being developed. So for a public sector company, it's very complex and in international law and so on. So the legal framework, of course, and also the operational management. And it was as if dealing with a new technological platform. These needed reorganization and also the regulatory capacity, this constant submission to Anvisa of documents, this rhythm of flow, it had to be adapted for the pandemic issues. So not just Fiocruz adapted itself, but other institutions as well. So just to conclude, I would like to mention and talking about, of course, South Center and global theme, not just focusing on Brazil, I would like to mention that the pandemic made it clear that there is a need to widen the development and production, not just of vaccines, but also of essential products for health, medicines, diagnosis, and also the production and distribution, not just locally, but run by the process of the principle that everybody has to be involved, that nobody can stay behind. countries that don't have access to essential goods. It's terrible to see that some countries can't get the COVID vaccine. So many countries haven't yet had the adequate access. So the pandemic has brought us these important lessons. We need to have structures that help these um, these areas that don't have such a good development. We always need to have local production whenever possible. We have to keep that in mind. And private public partnerships, the OMS hub idea, all of this can accelerate the local development. You need to have financing directed to the needs of these people who are left behind, and also the technology transfer processes that will ensure that these people who are less developed will also get the support. And many of the products that have been developed have received public resources. So we need to get over that. Pandemic has brought many lessons in the United Nations, in all the countries, in the WHO. And I think that there's no development without solidarity. Okay, thank you. Thank you,
apresentar não só o contexto e as questões estruturais que permitiram esse acordo de transferência, mas também os arranjos institucionais.
For presenting so many important issues and telling us which route to follow. I will now pass on the word to Tiago Rocca. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anna. Congratulations to Dr. Claudia and the Fiocruz team for their amazing work on fighting off the pandemic. We are here at Butantan, we have the same difficulties and challenges and we are facing them. And luckily, Brazil is able to have these labs that can contribute and have this structure as a differential and a way to deal with this crisis. Many developing countries don't actually have that possibility. Many countries who are also developing are ahead of us, and some are behind, of course, and we have to learn to evolve with these cases of countries that are ahead of us. Relating to the cases I'm going to bring here of local production and response to the pandemic, a point that Dr. Claudia has mentioned, dealing with a new agent, which is coronavirus, everybody was needing a new vaccine, a new therapy, something that didn't exist. And then there is a very important point when we talk about innovation, which is the technological risk. Who buys into this risk? Who invests in the technological risk? Few people do. And that's why we don't have nowadays in Brazil this is spread in the private area. The private area doesn't have the incentive mechanism that would allow it to take on this technological risk. And this ends up being a public interest. So here we're bringing the cases of public labs who have taken over that technological risk. They brought them into their institutions and they've taken over and decided to take on those risks with financing, with also, of course, the previous experience. Fiocruz and Butantan aren't starting today and having their first technology and production transfer. So it's a legacy that already exists, but that needs to be complemented, because what we see, especially in developing countries, let's choose, for example, one of the BRICS, especially India and China, is this facade of development and production of vaccines and medication in general. They are already well spread in their private networks. The big labs that are producing vaccines and medications from China and India, they are private companies. I don't mean to say that it needs to be privatized in Brazil. No, we need to find a way to spread so that Brazil can develop in other areas as well. We had an interesting uh, issue with Bioquímica trying to have a technology transfer to a private lab.
Mas enfim, é uma iniciativa, mas isso ainda
And
falta
I'm
mais.
not too sure what happened. It was an initiative, but this still needs to improve and have a better capacity of local production, also with private bodies helping to take on that risk. Now, you know, it's very overwhelming for just two institutions to take on such a big country. And I don't know if you see this, but the region of Latin America looks up to Brazil when there are these moments of crisis or of needs. You know, they look at us at Butantan, at Fiocruz. They are cases of examples for Latin America. So there is a way, a kind of a, not a dependency, but they look up to these institutions. So thinking about the cases that Butantan has brought to fight off the pandemic, we have two cases of vaccines, a vaccine that was inactive, which was something that Butantan already knew, but with an extra difficulty that we didn't have a lab with a very high level of biosafety in 3, biosafety scale 3. So we decided to bring it to the clinical development and the local production, but without a quick answer for bringing over the API. So this showed the importance of having more platforms, more technological bases spread all around the country, because we never know which will be the next agent that will cause another pandemic. At that time, we didn't have an industrial capacity to work with coronavirus as the end product, an active ingredient. We were able to deal with it. We had two campaigns that happened. So in terms of capacity for finalizing the process, we were already well prepared. And we started developing another vaccine, which is the Butantan vaccine that uses a technology platform that we already own and that we already know by embryos in eggs, and it can be fully developed in Brazil from the pilot batches, the first studies of production, and also the preclinical studies that were made with material generated from Brazil, and then having the first phase, then the second phase, and this is the vaccine developed nationally that is the most advanced nowadays. But we have the installed capacity to produce it. So once we advance to phase 3, this vaccine could be fully produced here in Brazil. Another case of technology that has already been used with the fight against COVID is the anti-COVID uh, liquid, and that was done in the same platform that we already use to produce other serums, you know. So we have heterological serums that are produced in horses, and with the right global means, we have a portfolio for treating bacteria infections, tetanus, diphtheria, even with accidents with animals. So this was used for developing the anti-COVID serum. It's already been developed in phase 1. And the clinical study, for who doesn't know it, the clinical study of a therapy is much more complex than a vaccine. You start from individuals who are already infected to be able to treat them after going through many safety proofs in animals. Then you need infected individuals to provide this clinical study. With the vaccines, you start with volunteers who are healthy. So the vaccine, although it needs more volunteers, it is less complex for the execution compared to therapies. So I just say how important it is to have platforms that are already implemented in the country so that you can move forward in developing. But not just that isn't enough. Dr. Claudia also mentioned we need financial resources. A clinical study has a very high cost. Building a factory has a huge cost. People with experience, it's intangible, because you can't hire them exactly when you need. So it's intangible, and that comes from legacy work that has been happening for many decades, and then you can have the staff that will be able to respond and help you at a moment of crisis. And especially thinking about the future, I think the country needs for sure to invest in research and development, have this quicker answer coming from the government. The local production solves a big part of the problem, but doesn't solve the whole problem. We have cases of countries that have a local production, but they didn't develop it because you end up not having critical mass, which is in the academia, in the science and technology institutions. And this is a model that works well with a complete chain for you to have a sustainable local production. I think I've already run out of time. So these were the topics that I've wanted to mention to you. So I'm available for questions. Thank you, Tiago. You've done great. You've respected your time. Thank you for your points. I will pass on the word to Professor Judit.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Bom.
Yes. I apologize. I'm going to speak in English. So I'm going to give a few seconds so we can shift to the translation. I would like to start by thanking the organizers, Idec and the South Center, for the invitation to UNDP. It's an honor to be part of this discussion. My name is Judit Rius Sanjuan, and I'm a policy specialist on health technologies, innovation and access at the UNDP Health and Development Group in New York, based in New York. For the ones that are not familiar with UNDP, UNDP stands for the United Nations Development Program. We are an international development agency within the United Nations systems. We work in Brazil as well as in more than 170 countries and territories, and our mandate is to support governments as well as other development partners in the efforts to eradicate poverty and reduce inequalities and fulfill the goals and targets of the Sustainable Development Goals within Agenda 2030. So increasing innovation and ensuring access, the widest possible access to medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines is already part of Agenda 2030 goals and targets, and it's inextricably linked to the goals of promoting universal health coverage that are part of the Agenda 2030 goals and targets that all governments have agreed. These efforts are, of course, equally important in times of pandemic prevention, preparedness, or response, like the ones that we're currently living with COVID-19. So I just want to highlight that this is important for COVID-19, the discussion we're having today, but it's beyond COVID-19. It's an effort promoting local production and increasing access to health technologies is an effort linked to many other objectives and goals within Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. This panel focuses on one important aspect of these efforts, that is how to increase access to COVID-19 vaccines by promoting local production and technology transfer. And UNDP agrees wholeheartedly that this is an important intervention within the ecosystems of tools that governments and development partners should have to increase access and supply capacity for health technologies. And we also recognize that this has been neglected, especially in the field of COVID-19 technologies, including vaccines. One of the most important lessons learned with the ongoing pandemic and the inequities in access to COVID-19 technologies, including vaccines, that we're still witnessing, is the importance to finance and support local innovation, local manufacturing and technological development from not the beginning of the pandemic, but from before the pandemics even hit us. And I think both Dr. Claudia Chamas and Dr. Tiago Rocca have very clearly exposed how years of investment and support to government-funded institutions in Brazil has allowed us to have a much better ecosystem in Brazil than we have in many other countries in terms of promoting local production and technology transfer. And the importance for this investment and this support to be sustained before, during, and after pandemics are with us. It is a pleasure to follow the presentation of Dr. Claudia Chamas and Tiago Rocca. They are two leading experts in this field, and they have presented very clearly, I think, two models of technology transfer and local production. Claudia Chamas has focused, Dr. Claudia Chamas has focused in a model that I will categorize as a north-south or south-north model between a European and a Brazilian institution. Dr. Tiago Rocca has focused more on a potential model for south-south cooperation, including the example of Brazil and Chinese manufacturers. These are all important and valid models and should be supported. There's a lot of lessons learned that both previous speakers have highlighted that I don't want to repeat. I want to mention a third example, in case it's useful. This is an example where UNDP has been involved. UNDP is a member of the steering committee of the WHO Costa Rica COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP for short. And as many of you might know, a few weeks ago, the Spanish National Research Council, or CSIS, another publicly funded institution, announced the first worldwide voluntary license to CTAP and the medicines patent pool for the patents and know-how of an important diagnostic technology. And the goal of that license is to facilitate local manufacture and technology transfer for an important technology. This represents the first global, transparent, non-exclusive license that we are aware in terms of COVID health technologies. And it includes, I believe, all countries in the world. It's the first license that goes into this new multilateral initiative promoted by the government of Costa Rica, hosted by the WHO, that aims to create a concept of a patent pool that is an old concept in the global health, but applied lessons learned on patent pooling and collective management of intellectual property and know-how management to the field of pandemic preparedness and response. So there's important lessons learned in that third example also that I think are important for this conversation. Because from a public health and development perspective, not all voluntary technology transfer and patent licensing deals are equal. The devil is always in the details in this field. For example, some technology transfer agreements that we have seen limit the freedom to manufacture, to innovate, and to commercialize the technology that they provide. Others limit the countries that could benefit from this technology transfer. There are a variety of different terms and conditions that are being included in some of this technology transfer that are not ideal from a public health and development perspectives. From a UNDP perspective, we believe it is extremely important that voluntary license and technology transfer agreements include all countries in need of access to these technologies, including middle-income countries like Brazil that are sometimes excluded from these agreements and these voluntary agreements for technology transfer. So that's an important key enabler, is that the terms and conditions are appropriate from a public health and development perspective. A second enabler or key aspect is for a good negotiation and a good public health outcome is access to data, information, and transparency. It is essential that all the parties in an agreement, as well as the government and the general public, have access to key information to have the best decision, to take the best decision from a public health and development perspective. Important access to information include the level of investments, the cost of manufacturing, the price of the technologies, but also the contractual terms in general of these agreements, including the voluntary patent license, the technology transfer agreements, and the advanced purchase agreements that we have seen many governments and private and public parties negotiate during COVID-19. We have learned that contracts and efforts that are more transparent and they share the terms have positive, better and positive in public health and development impact. We have talked a lot about voluntary licensing these patents and voluntary technology transfer and bilateral agreements. We think they're essential tools for technological development and building manufacturing capacity. But it is essential that governments and development partners, including the public and the private sector, have an ecosystem of all the tools they need to promote an enabling environment to facilitate cooperation and partnerships for technological developments. Beyond voluntary technology transfer agreements, it is important that we have also enabling and coherent legal and regulatory environments at a national level. Both Dr. Chamas and Dr. Rocca have talked very eloquently about it. I just want to highlight that there is many tools that governments and partners should have or have to promote an enabling coherent legal and regulatory environment. This includes, of course, access to intellectual property, know-how, manufacturing materials. We are familiar with the rights and the capacities that countries have to use TRIPS flexibilities. This has been well discussed since the Doha Declaration in 2001, so it's not a new issue that countries should have legal regimes ready and appropriately designed to be able to use to the maximum of their convenience the flexibilities included in the WTO TRIPS agreement. We also know that there are new tools that some countries are using very effectively, including competition law, regulatory strategies, and procurement processes that are better designed to respond to pandemics and to other global public health needs. So there is an ecosystem, basically, of legal and regulatory interventions that all countries should have, and the regulatory and the legal framework that Dr. Chamas mentioned should be comprehensive and include all and the above and many more legal and coherent environments. The issue of policy coherence and legal environments, there's a lot of focus on national policy coherence and legal environments, and it is essential, but there is also a need for global coherence and global norms on this issue. This is not new. The need for policy coherence and regulatory and legal environments at the global level is an old issue. Just the final report, for example, of the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines in 2017 already recommended member states to start the negotiations on a global research and development treaty. Other panels of experts and commissions have already recommended in the past that member states agree and negotiate global norms on these issues to allow for an environment that promotes equitable access and innovation to essential health technologies. It is potentially back on the agenda, as you all know. Very recently at a World Health Assembly, special World Health Assembly, member states had agreed to start the negotiations of a global pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response agreement. We don't know if it's going to be a treaty, an agreement, or a recommendation, but some type of global norms on pandemic preparedness. And we think this is an important opportunity for member states and development partners to ensure that issues of local production and technology transfer are well defined and well designed also at the global level. We also know that at the WTO, there are also important negotiations on the South African and the Indian government proposal for a TRIPS waiver, for a global TRIPS waiver, temporary global TRIPS waiver during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are all important discussions at a global level that have a direct impact in national environments and enabling environments. So it's important that we talk and we engage in both national, regional, and global strategies. My time is up, I think. I'm getting a little alert, so I would just like to conclude by thanking the organizers for the invitation and reminding all of us of the call to action made by the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez that COVID-19 vaccines, and I will argue COVID-19 health technologies, including diagnostics and potential therapeutics, should be considered a global public good. And that the capacity that we have to design legal and policy strategies and technological development strategies to ensure equitable access to all who need them is a fundamental test for our pledge of leaving no one behind and properly responding to this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Nós que agradecemos, professora, pela sua participação e contribuição tão valiosa. O seu tempo foi cumprido à risca também.
Thank you for your contribution. You did great. You were on time. I would like to thank you all for being here, this debate. We can now move on to some questions. I would like to ask a round of questions to Professor Claudia and Professor Tiago, talking a little bit. You brought on this issue of the importance of a previous infrastructure that already existed and the practice of arrangements, institutional arrangements that already existed, but what helped to build this agreement. So maybe if you could comment on how these experiences dealt in Fiocruz and also Fiocruz and also in Butantan, how did they deal with the risk distribution between the agreement partners, but also facing control organs such as the Union Accounts Court? And for Professor Judit, I'd like, if possible, talk a little bit about how you evaluate the voluntary transfer of policies, especially taking into consideration this experience that you've brought from CETAP. This alternative is very criticized by many organizations. What would be the potentials of this alternative, and what's necessary, in your opinion, for this to work? If we could follow the presentation order, I would ask Professor Claudia, then Tiago, then Judit.
Ótimo. Então, por favor, professora Cláudia.
Ok. Bem, eu acho que o sucesso...
I think that the success from Fiocruz and Butantan, as Tiago has already commented, is due to this infrastructure and this previous experience. They were essential for choosing the technologies, negotiating, preparing. But relating to the risks and the uncertainties, as I mentioned at the beginning, this pandemic brought never before seen and we are thinking about having this technology transfer that wasn't really registered. And this was imposed by the sanitation conditions that the planet went through and is still going through. So the institutions had to deal with that, and not just in Brazil. So many technology transfer processes and also the purchasing, they were impacted by this situation, which was very peculiar. It's still a learning process. It will take us a long time before we understand all the particularities of this process. In my conception, we are going to still need a long time to analyze where we got it right, where we got it wrong, and what we can do for future technologies. One of the choices of the legal framework was the technology purchasing to provide with safety in the public field so that the institution could invest in this. And with the analysis of all the conversations between the governmental bodies and the companies, this was the solution. So maybe we will analyze this process and maybe we will need to improve the process for the future. But we have this innovation, this access to innovation. It has never before seen characteristics in time, speed, and relations with the regulatory agency in all processes. But what we can learn from this, connecting with what Tiago and Judit said, is that local development, local production, stable financing directed to capacitating technology, the technology capacitation, this is the basics. We need to have in level of policies, public policies, global health. These are the demands for it to be ready. With neglected illnesses, and non-neglected illnesses that also affect the populations who are neglected, and also the emergency issues such as a pandemic. Without that investment, we will offer less than we can. We've seen the example of South Africa contributing with the identification of the Omicron variant by using genomic vigilance. Imagine how much more that area can offer in terms of creativity, intellectual potential, uh, North and South cooperation, also South-South cooperation. So we have an agenda to work in the next few years, and we have a discussion in WHO, PNUD, in the pandemic treaty, and so on. So this agenda is open, and I hope you can get the best from it. Thank you.
Bom, acho que com relação aos casos aqui do Butantan,
relating to the cases here at Butantan, especially in formatting the partnerships in the legal framework, we already had some previous experiences of development in conjunction, not in a context of a pandemic, of course, but in a health issue in Brazil. We have developed the dengue vaccine, the chikungunya vaccine. All these vaccines have a technological risk, of course. They don't have the same speed and the same need for it to be developed, such as COVID, but they are cases before the pandemic that there were also partnerships and for us to have. So what we use here is very intrinsic to Butantan, São Paulo, which I think is a little bit different from the case that Claudia mentioned. We base a lot in the innovation law from the state of São Paulo. The Butantan Institute is an institution of science and technology working together with the health secretary of the state. It's a regional mechanism, but it's part as ICT, it seeks innovation. It's not just because it was this public need, an emergency public need such as COVID, but if we take other cases, dengue, chikungunya, and other situations, I think it's a case of neglected illnesses, It's an instrument that we can use to create partnerships, develop and share the risks with our partner. I hope that I've answered the question. If you need anything else, let me know. That was great. Please, Judit.
Anna, I think you were asking me about the limits of voluntary strategies, if I understood your question correctly. And I'm going to start by saying something positive about voluntary strategies. I think we have to acknowledge that voluntary sharing and cooperation is a positive, and that we should all want more of that. I agree that it's been quite limited in the current pandemic. We have two examples today from Brazil, but if you look at the global situation, the level of technology transfer and sharing and voluntary cooperation has been quite limited in COVID-19. And overall, I think many, and including, of course, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, and the head of UNDP, many have said that we will be in a better place today in the response of COVID-19 if there have been more voluntary sharing and partnerships from the beginning of COVID-19. So I don't want to be negative on voluntary license, but I agree with you, Anna, that not all voluntary license and technology transfer are equal. And there is a space for improvement on some of the agreements and some of the partnerships that have been created during COVID-19 and before COVID-19. I think the key lessons learned are it is better when the terms of these agreements are publicly available and there is a public scrutiny by the government and members of parliament, civil society, and other partners. And there's a level of learning from the negotiations and an evolution of these negotiations and a public health evaluation of these negotiations. We have also learned that some technology transfer limit the scope of what can be transferred and the manufacturing at country level. And we basically believe, I think, that as that appropriate technology transfer and voluntary strategies need to create enabling environments for technological development that are sustainable, long-term, and that really reach all the population in need and that create long-term technological development. And I mentioned the issues of geographical limitations. I think that's quite frequent. We have seen some of the voluntary licenses that have been signed that exclude many of countries that are considered middle-income countries. And that's a problem. I think that's a huge challenge from a public health perspective when countries considered middle-income countries are not included in our strategies for technological development and access to technological access to scientific knowledge, access to scientific innovation. So yes, there are limitations in many of the agreements that we have seen. Therefore, and it's from the beginning, we know that any voluntary strategy needs to be complemented with an enabling legal environment at country level that allows for non-voluntary strategies to also rise and to be used by governments and development partners. So it's not either or, it has to be a combination of strategies. But I will argue transparency is a key tool to improve and creating enabling legal environment at country level and hopefully also at global level, as Claudia was arguing, could help us in the future to improve the impact of these agreements.
Perfeito. Muito obrigada, Judit, pelas suas considerações.
Thank you, Judit, for your considerations. I think I agree with what we've brought on here and what you reinforce, creating an ecosystem of tools that will allow us to have a better production, that the solution isn't the A or B tool, but it's the set of vaccines. I would like to thank everyone who's been following this transition on YouTube. And let's go to the final considerations. I just want to make an observation. Claudia has brought it, Tiago has brought it, which is a little of local production isn't the only answer. Of course, that's why we work with so many tools. And also remind you that in Brazil at this moment, there is a proposal going through the system to revoke vetoes. He approved a mini waiver, let's say, a proposal of acceptance and liberation of technologies. There were some vetoes to that. And the subject is at the moment being approved or appreciated in Brazilian Congress. So this shows that Brazil has a series of experiences, very interesting experiences, this history and infrastructure for local production. and initiatives that will increase these tools that authorities and labs, private labs, and also public labs will have. So I would like to pass on the floor to you just for your final considerations, and please follow the presentation order. Claudia, you can start, please. Thank you, Anna. I think it was an amazing panel. I think that we were able to have very complementary perspectives. Tiago, Judit, and your own questions and comments made us think about it, and we're going to leave here with new questions, reinforcing your last comment about local production. I think it's essential for us to have that in perspective in public policy, but the local production needs to be fed by a scientific system with a production, scientific and technological, that is very strong. We need to be connected as a network because the worries of Brazilian society have a lot in common with the Indian society or with other peoples and with many South countries. And we have a tradition of cooperating with European and American countries. So we have to cooperate more, interact more as part of the network, share data, know-how, and so on. And I think, well, I'm very satisfied with our panel. It was great. Thank you for having me once again. Well, I would also like to thank you for having me, for inviting me. It was a pleasure to share this panel with you. So much learning from listening to your experiences. It's very of a future case. And I'm sure the local production isn't the only mechanism. It's an important part, but this needs to be seen, more broadly as a policy of states for to face global crisis, and that they can be more synchronized and more equitative. The result. Thank you.
From my side, also to thank the organizers, Idec, South Center, and my two co-panelists, Tiago and Claudia. It's been an honor to have this discussion with all of you. This is a very complicated, but I think extremely important discussion that you have convened today. Thank you on behalf of UNDP for supporting a dialogue on these important issues and raising the visibility of these issues in Brazil and globally. So, obrigada, and thank you for having us today.
Nós que agradecemos, gente. Bom, é só lembrando que
we thank you guys. The recording of the event will stay in the Idec YouTube, and also the recording in different languages will be in the South Center channel. Thank you. See you soon. Bye bye. Bye bye. 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 Thank you.
Desculpa, gente, também esqueci de agradecer
I forgot to thank you, to thank the interpreters. Thank you to the interpreters for all their work. Thank you. Thank you to the